February 1943. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad had fallen silent. The surrender of Germany's Sixth Army did more than erase an elite fighting force. It shattered the illusion that the Wehrmacht could not be defeated. Across Europe, the news spread like a shockwave. For Adolf Hitler, defeat was unthinkable. Yet on the vast Eastern Front, reality had begun to replace confidence. Far to the west of the smoking city, the front line bent outward into a massive bulge around the city of Kursk. Stretching nearly 250 kilometers from north to south, this salient became the obvious target. To German planners, it looked like an opportunity. Strike from both sides, cut it off, and destroy hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in one decisive blow. But time was no longer Germany's ally. Every week the offensive was delayed. Soviet factories delivered more T-34 tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft to the front. Intelligence reports warned that the Red Army was digging in, yet Hitler hesitated, waiting for new Tiger and Panther tanks that promised battlefield superiority. Across the lines, Soviet commanders studied every German movement. They believed the attack would come, and instead of rushing forward, they prepared to receive it. The greatest armored battle in history, spring turned to summer, and while the German High Command debated the perfect moment to strike, the Soviet Union used every passing day to transform the Kursk salient into a fortress. Under the direction of the Soviet High Command, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians labored around the clock. Trenches stretched across the countryside like scars carved into the earth. Anti-tank ditches cut through open fields. Barbed wire tangled every likely avenue of attack. Beneath the soil, millions of mines were carefully laid, creating one of the most heavily fortified battlefields in military history. The defenses were not a single line, but a series of deep defensive belts. If the Germans broke through one, another waited behind it, followed by yet another. Hidden artillery batteries were carefully registered on likely targets. Camouflaged anti-tank guns watched over narrow approaches. Behind them, powerful armored reserves stood ready, concealed from German reconnaissance and waiting for the decisive moment. The Soviet strategy demanded discipline. Frontline troops were ordered to absorb the initial assault rather than launch premature counterattacks. Every kilometer surrendered would come at a terrible cost to the attacker. Across the front, German reconnaissance detected growing Soviet preparations, but many commanders still believed superior training, armored strength, and tactical skill could overcome even the deepest defenses. Neither side intended to retreat. By early July, the battlefield had become a vast killing ground, waiting only for the first shot. Before dawn on July 5th, 1943, the silence over the Kursk salient was broken, not by the Germans, but by the Soviets. Having gathered intelligence that the offensive was imminent, Soviet artillery opened a preemptive bombardment against suspected German assembly areas. The shells disrupted preparations, but they could not stop what had already been set in motion. Across the front, thousands of German guns answered in thunderous unison, and Operation Citadel officially began. From the north, Colonel General Walter Model's Ninth Army advanced toward Kursk. From the south, Colonel General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, supported by Army Detachment Kempf, pushed forward with Germany's most formidable armored formations. Their objective was simple in theory: drive through the Soviet defenses from opposite directions, encircle the salient, and destroy the forces trapped inside. At first light, columns of Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, Panzer IVs, assault guns, and mechanized infantry rolled across the open countryside. Dust rose behind them, while dive bombers and fighters roared overhead. It was one of the largest concentrations of armored power ever assembled, but almost immediately the offensive slowed. German spearheads encountered dense minefields, carefully hidden anti-tank positions, and relentless artillery fire. Every village had become a strongpoint. Every ridge concealed another layer of resistance. What German planners had hoped would be a rapid breakthrough was turning into a brutal battle of attrition. The offensive had begun. Now Germany would discover just how deep the Soviet trap truly was. As the German advance gathered momentum, the battlefield itself became its greatest enemy. The first explosions came without warning. Beneath the tracks of advancing tanks, hidden Soviet mines erupted in violent bursts of earth, steel, and fire. A single disabled vehicle could halt an entire column, forcing engineers to clear narrow paths while artillery shells rained down around them. The delays multiplied. Mine-clearing teams worked under constant fire, crawling forward with metal detectors, probes, and explosives. Every meter gained came at the cost of precious time and lives. Even Germany's newest armored vehicles struggled. The heavily armored Tiger tanks proved formidable against Soviet defenses, but their numbers were limited. Many of the newly introduced Panther tanks rushed into combat before all technical issues had been resolved, suffered mechanical breakdowns that reduced the strength of the attacking formations. Meanwhile, Ferdinand tank destroyers delivered devastating firepower at long range, but lacked machine guns for close defense, leaving them vulnerable when Soviet infantry closed the distance. The Red Army had planned for exactly this moment. Camouflaged anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions. Mortars blanketed the advancing infantry. Soviet soldiers emerged from hidden trenches to strike isolated vehicles with grenades and anti-tank weapons before disappearing into the smoke once more. By the end of the first days, German forces had advanced, but far more slowly than expected. Every kilometer was measured not in speed, but in wrecked vehicles, exhausted men, and mounting casualties. The offensive was still moving forward, but ahead lay a place where steel would collide with steel on a scale the world had never witnessed. While armored columns fought through trenches and minefields below, another battle raged high above the smoke-covered plains of Kursk. From the opening hours of Operation Citadel, the Luftwaffe launched relentless strikes against Soviet artillery positions, supply routes, and troop concentrations. Dive bombers descended through the clouds with terrifying precision, while fighter aircraft dueled across the summer sky in an effort to control the battlefield below. But this was no longer the air war of 1941. The Soviet Air Force had grown dramatically in both strength and experience. Fresh aircraft rolled from factories in staggering numbers, and veteran pilots, hardened by years of combat, rose to meet the German assault. As the days passed, the skies above Kursk filled with twisting dogfights, tracer fire, and burning aircraft falling toward the earth. On the ground, artillery remained the true master of destruction. Thousands of guns fired almost continuously, pounding advancing armor. shattering defensive positions and turning villages into fields of rubble. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed deafening salvos that blanketed entire sectors with explosions, while German heavy artillery answered with crushing bombardments of its own. The battlefield disappeared beneath towering columns of dust and smoke. Visibility dropped to mere meters. Communications faltered. Units became separated, and commanders increasingly relied on instinct rather than clear orders. Every hour, the cost of the offensive grew heavier. Yet in the south, German armored spearheads continued to push forward. Their objective was no longer simply Kursk. It was a small railway junction called Prokhorovka, where both sides were unknowingly racing toward a confrontation that would define the battle forever. By the second week of July, the German offensive had narrowed to its greatest point of promise. In the southern sector, Colonel General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army continued to press forward despite mounting losses. At the tip of the advance was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, fighting through stubborn Soviet resistance toward the small settlement of Prokhorovka. Each village captured, each ridgeline secured, came only after fierce combat that drained men, ammunition, and fuel. The Soviets understood exactly what was at stake. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the Soviet High Command had anticipated that the southern thrust posed the greatest danger. Behind the defensive belts, powerful reserve formations waited for the decisive moment. Among them was the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov. Its mission was not merely to stop the Germans, but to strike with overwhelming force before they could break through. As both armies converged on Prokhorovka, the battlefield grew increasingly confined. Rolling farmland, shallow ravines, railway embankments, and scattered collective farms restricted movement, reducing the room available for large armored maneuvers. Dust hung constantly in the air, while burned-out tanks marked the path of every advance. Neither side possessed a complete picture of the other's strength. German commanders believed victory was still within reach. Soviet commanders knew delay could prove disastrous. By the evening of July 11th, thousands of armored vehicles stood within striking distance of one another. With sunrise, the waiting would end. The next day would become one of the most fiercely contested moments of the Battle of Kursk, and one of the most debated armored engagements in military history. At first light on July 12, 1943, the quiet fields around Prokhorovka erupted into chaos. Soviet armored formations surged forward in a massive counterattack, determined to halt the German advance before it could break through to Kursk. Dust clouds rolled across the landscape as hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns converged on a battlefield already scarred by days of relentless fighting. The terrain quickly erased the advantages of long-range firepower. Shallow ravines, railway embankments, smoke, and swirling dust compressed the engagement into a series of violent, close-range encounters. Crews often spotted enemy tanks only moments before opening fire. Split-second decisions determined survival. German Tiger tanks, with their powerful guns and thick armor, inflicted heavy losses wherever they found clear fields of fire. Yet the Soviet T-34s pressed relentlessly, exploiting speed, numbers, and every fold of the terrain to close the distance. Around them, anti-tank guns, artillery, infantry, and aircraft added to the confusion, making Prokhorovka far more than a simple tank versus tank battle. For decades, the fighting at Prokhorovka was described as the largest single tank clash in history. Modern research paints a more complex picture, suggesting that while the engagement was one of the war's most intense armored battles, the number of tanks directly engaged at one time was likely lower than early post-war accounts claimed. What remains beyond dispute is its brutality. By nightfall, the fields were littered with burning vehicles, shattered equipment, and exhausted survivors. Neither side had achieved a decisive tactical breakthrough. But the German offensive had lost something far more important than momentum. It had lost the initiative. In the days after Prokhorovka, the battlefield told a different story. German units still held disciplined formations, and many remained capable of fierce local attacks. But the pace of the offensive had slowed to a crawl. Every advance demanded enormous effort, while Soviet resistance only seemed to grow stronger. Fresh infantry appeared where exhausted defenders had fallen. New artillery batteries opened fire from concealed positions. Reserve tanks emerged from behind the front, replacing losses with remarkable speed. The German advantage in tactical skill could no longer overcome the realities of attrition. Weeks of relentless combat had drained fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and experienced crews. Panthers that had survived the minefields required repairs. Tigers, though formidable, were too few to change the course of an entire campaign. Infantry divisions that had begun the offensive at full strength were now fighting with mounted casualties. Then, events far beyond the Eastern Front reshaped Hitler's calculations. On July 10th, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily, opening a new front in southern Europe. As the situation worsened in the Mediterranean, pressure mounted on Germany's already stretched military resources. Faced with deteriorating conditions on multiple fronts, Hitler met with his senior commanders and decided to halt Operation Citadel before its objectives could be achieved. For the soldiers still fighting around Kursk, the order changed little in the immediate moment. The shelling continued. Patrols still clashed in ruined villages. Men still died for ground that would soon be abandoned. But strategically, the battle had reached its turning point. Germany had launched its last major offensive in the east. From this moment onward, the Red Army would increasingly dictate where and when the next great battles would be fought. Even before the last hopes of Operation Citadel had faded, the Soviet High Command was preparing its response. On July 12, 1943, as fierce fighting continued around Prokhorovka, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov against the German-held Orel salient north of Kursk. Fresh Soviet armies surged forward behind crushing artillery barrages, forcing Germany's Ninth Army onto the defensive. Positions that had taken months to prepare were abandoned under relentless pressure. The German command now faced an impossible choice: reinforce the stalled offensive around Kursk or save threatened sectors elsewhere. There were not enough reserves to do both. Weeks later, on August 3rd, the Soviets struck again, with Operation Rumyantsev, driving toward Belgorod and Kharkov. Exhausted German formations fought stubbornly, conducting skillful delaying actions, but they could no longer regain the initiative. The momentum had shifted irreversibly. As Soviet armored columns advanced westward, civilians emerged from villages devastated by 2 years of occupation and warfare. Many found little left but burned homes, shattered churches, and fields littered with wrecked vehicles. For them, victory came hand in hand with unimaginable destruction. By late August, the Battle of Kursk had effectively ended. The front line had moved, but something even more significant had changed. For the first time since Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army seized the strategic initiative, and it would never relinquish it. From this point until the fall of Berlin, it would be Germany that fought a long, exhausting retreat across Eastern Europe. The Battle of Kursk did not end with a single dramatic surrender or a decisive encirclement. Instead, it marked the moment when the balance of the war shifted beyond Germany's ability to recover. The cost was staggering. Across weeks of fighting, both sides suffered enormous losses in men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Entire divisions were worn down in battles measured not by spectacular breakthroughs, but by relentless attrition. The fields around Kursk became graveyards of twisted steel, where burned-out tanks remained scattered across the landscape long after the guns had fallen silent. For Germany, the consequences were profound. Although the Wehrmacht continued to fight with determination and tactical skill, it never again launched a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, German forces were increasingly compelled to respond to Soviet offensives rather than dictate the course of the campaign. For the Soviet Union, victory came at an immense price. Thousands of soldiers never returned home, and countless families carried the scars of the battle for generations. Yet the Red Army had demonstrated that it could not only withstand Germany's strongest blow, but also seize the initiative and maintain it until the war's end. Perhaps that is why the title, Why No One Escaped the Battle of Kursk, carries a deeper meaning. Some never escaped the battlefield itself. Others survived, but carried its memories for the rest of their lives. And Germany, despite all its remaining strength, never escaped the consequences of what happened on those summer fields in 1943. The road to Berlin did not begin in triumph. It began in the smoke, fire, and shattered armor of Kursk.